We're going to discuss review of safety-related regulations and standards, which is chapter 2 of your textbook. Just like previously, you should have read the chapter first, and then you can review this as you follow along in the PowerPoint. So the learning objectives. Discuss the difference between regulations and standards. Discuss the concept of standard of care. List and discuss federal regulations that may have an impact on emergency responder safety and health programs. List and discuss the major national Fire Protection Association standards that have an impact on emergency responders' occupational safety and health programs. Discuss the role of related regulations and standards and their safety and health implications. So as an introduction, you must have a knowledge and understanding of these health and safety related standards and regulations because it's essential in our day-to-day function in the emergency services now. These will be covered in Life Safety Initiatives 5, 6, 11, 12, 15, and 16. So you can see there's 6 of the 16 life safety initiatives that are covered with this material. And remember that regulations and standards are essential components and play an important role in the comprehensive safety and health programs in the fire service. So the first thing we're going to talk about is regulations. And the difference we're going to talk about regulations versus standards. Regulations have the weight of law, which means that they're mandatory. They're mandatory requirements. You have 50 titles in the Code of Federal Regulations, also known as CFR. There's Title 29, which includes occupational safety and health regulations. And then you have states that have adopted these regulations. So we'll talk about those in the future. Standards. Standards are not mandatory, and technically fire departments do not have to follow them. But let's look at one of the standards out there, which is commonly known as a consensus standard. An NFPA is probably the best example. And like the text here says, is that it's not mandatory unless adopted into law by local state legislation. Then these standards could become the standard of care. But let's use an example. And when we say they're consensus standards, is that NFPA is composed of both the end users, which are typically firefighters, and the manufacturers who make the material. Now, if we choose not to follow NFPA and a firefighter is killed or even severely injured and it goes to court, and all of these will end up in court, attorney is going to say, well, Chief, why didn't you follow NFPA? Well, it costs too much and we don't have to. And they're going to say, well, Chief, but aren't these consensus standards of NFPA, aren't they developed by your fire service industry professionals and experts? And the chief would have to answer yes. And typically a jury is going to say, no, then you really have to follow them. There's not too many NFPA standards that people don't follow. A fire department is going to purchase a new fire engine. They will have in the bid specs that it must meet NFPA because they're not going to take that liability. And the manufacturers aren't going to sell you one that doesn't meet NFPA unless you put it in writing that you don't want something there, because neither side wants to be sued. Standard of care. This means, and just like it says here on the screen, responders must perform in the same way as another reasonable person with the same training and equipment would perform. And this avoids liability. If you treat everybody the same, then that is a responsible standard of care. It's if you start to treat people different, then you will have some liability. And this comes primarily from the medical field, but this is all the fire service. And there's certain expectations when it comes to performance. For instance, you wouldn't send one engine to a fire in one neighborhood and then what we call a full assignment, maybe 3 engines, 2 trucks, an RA, and a battalion chief to another, because one is we'll say a wealthier neighborhood than the other. Again, as long as you treat everybody the same, you'll never get in trouble. Now we're going to talk about federal OSHA, or Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And I'm going to tell you right now, I disagree with the author of this book. The author of this book says that federal OSHA has no direct enforcement authority over state and local governments. That's not my understanding of this. My understanding is that OSHA is there for all states unless you have your own state program like we do here in California, because there is federal OSHA laws that everybody must follow. Now, for like state of California, Fed OSHA's approved our plan. Our plan can be more stringent, but it cannot be less stringent. And what I mean by that is that, let's say OSHA has a rule, we can't say, well, we're not going to do that one part of the rule, we'll do the other. We must follow everything. Now, we can make it tougher, but we can't make it easier. And there's requirements to be met. Currently, there's 27 states and territories that have state OSHAs. And like I said earlier, they're covered by regulations of Fed OSHA. And these are the states here that have their own OSHA plans. So we'll talk about some of these OSHA regulations. OSHA 1910-146, or commonly referred to as 29 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. And this refers to permit required confined spaces. What is a permit required confined space? This is the definition. Large enough that a person can bodily enter and perform assigned work, it has limited or restricted means for entry and exit, and is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. And I'm showing you a picture here of a confined space that we went on in Pasadena, and you can see where the welder was inside. You can see the welding cables. You can't see the welder because he fell down and hurt his back. Now, because this is a confined space, we had to do many things before entering the space, and you cannot cross that barrier plane right there where that entry is without doing these things like monitoring the atmosphere, making sure your employers have self-contained breathing apparatus, and so on. So there's quite a few things you have to do if it's a permit required confined space. And this is a whole 40-hour class for this course. OSHA's 1910-134 is respiratory protection. This is commonly referred to also as 2 in, 2 out. And we in the fire service commonly refer to 2 in, 2 out. What it really is the Respiratory Protection Act. It has aspects of it, the control of occupational diseases, prevents atmospheric contamination, engineering control measures, respiratories must be provided when necessary. What it says in there is that employers must provide respiratory protection for all their employees. They must have their employees have medical evaluations prior to using the respirators. So if you're going to use a respirator, whether it be a self-contained breathing apparatus or some kind of other respirator, you must have an annual physical. And typically you'll get a chest x-ray about every 2 years. And make sure that you have to have the proper respirator for your type of work. OSHA's 1910-120 is Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response, commonly referred to as HAZWOPER. And you must have a written plan that's made available to all employees. And the implication is powerful and multifaceted. What it means is that if you don't have it, then you're really going to be in the trouble, and there's different parts. Employers must certify that competency have been met in PPE and in their training levels. So both of those must be met. And there's 4 levels of training in OSHA, the OSHA regulations. There's the awareness level, which as a minimum training for all employers. There's the operational level, and this is the level that all firefighters in California should be trained to. Then what you have is you have the technician level, and these are the hazardous materials techs that will respond to the scene like you see here in this picture here. Okay, and then we have the specialist. Now typically a specialist is someone, for instance in the city of Pasadena we have one specialist, and that person handles all the hazmat inspections and has knowledge of hazmat, has knowledge of all the locations, and they are an additional resource for us. 40 CFR 311 mirrors OSHA's 1910-120. OSHA 1910-156, this in itself is the OSHA regulation for fire brigades. Now you'll see that fire brigades do not have to follow NFPA 1500. They're all covered in OSHA 1910-156. So fire brigades, industrial fire departments, and private or contractual type fire departments. And there it has all the requirements for employer that they must meet to have a fire brigade. It talks about the organization, the training, and the personal protective equipment. OSHA 1910-130 is occupational exposure to bloodborne pathogens. What this deals with is the occupational exposures for employees. The hepatitis B virus, human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, and other bloodborne pathogens. This helps the safety program manager comply with OSHA. And in my mind, in today's fire service, this is where we have our greatest risk. We're always running across patients that have HIV, hepatitis B, or the different hepatitis A and C also, they're all out there, and any other bloodborne pathogens. We must have proper safety equipment. You see in the picture there, most employees have some type of a bag, and they'll have gloves ready. They'll have a respirator there for medical calls. They'll have eye protection. And they show here seatbelt cutter, also scissors and a note. But really the 3 things you have to have is you have to have eye protection, respiratory protection, and hand protection, so that, like it used to be where you just get all bloodied and everything, now you should have a level of protection. And if you get blood on you, then you are at a great risk to contract a disease. So you should have a control plan. It should be reviewed and updated annually, and sooner than later. So you should have it done before you start sending people out on medicals. OSHA General Duty Clause. This was enacted in 1970, and part of the elements of General Duty Clause is because people fail to keep workplace free of hazard. If you're an employee, you deserve to have a workplace free of hazards, and that you recognize the hazards. This typically is hazards that are likely to cause death or serious injury. There has to be a method to correct the hazards. What you'll typically see is that fire departments have each of their station supervisors check their stations on a regular basis, and they have a form that they send in to their safety officer. They must have a relationship with the consensus standards, so know what the hazards are out there. NFPA 1500. This was first published in 1987, and it does not apply to fire brigades, like I said earlier. But this is probably one of the most significant documents that was created to protect the fire service. And back when it was published in 1987, I would say that it was there, but most fire departments that I'm aware of didn't follow it, and it wasn't, I don't believe, till almost the 2000s where it really became mandatory that people follow it. This is to protect the firefighter. The goal is that we take advantage of current technology and procedures. It used to be that if we never washed our turnout gear, if you had a hole in it, well, that's just the way it was. Well, nowadays there's procedures for washing it, there's timelines for washing it, and it states in there that you can't have holes. And so, this is part of our safety and health program, and it should incorporate standards into the requirements. It covers other parts of NFPA, and you should include this in all your safety documents. There's 47 other NFPA standards incorporated that also reference NFPA 1500. So you can see that it's all over. Some of them from the 1500 series, you'll see is 1521, 61, 81, 82, 83. 1521 is the standard for fire department safety officer. 1561 is the emergency services incident management system. 1581 is the infection control program. 1582 is comprehensive occupational medical program for fire departments. And 1583 is standard and health-related fitness programs for the firefighters. And we'll review all of these in future chapters, but these are probably the 5 most important that deal directly with the welfare of the firefighter. And what these 5 do is they're trying to prepare ahead of time for things that the firefighter might be exposed to and try to prevent them from having these fatal or serious injuries. 1521, again, is the standard for fire department safety officers. The fire chief can appoint a health safety officer, but understand this is not a department incident safety officer. This is someone that's in charge of your whole safety program. It need not be a department officer. In some departments, it could be a doctor. Other standards and regulations apply. There is American National Standards Institute, also called ANSI. There's ASTM International. There's the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. There's the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. There's the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. And this was created as part of the Center for Disease Control and created as part of the act that created OSHA. This is a pretty interesting place that I recommend that all firefighters that they visit their site, because they're always doing training. And as I make this video right now, they're doing training on what the minimum number of firefighters should be sent up into a high-rise before fire attack begins. And it's based on tests. They'll go out and do actual tests in vacant buildings, and then they'll come up with their recommendation. There's the Ryan White Comprehensive AIDS Act. The important thing for us here, this designates an infection control officer. And this allows notification of employees by the medical facilities and allows follow-up. This is a really important act, and what it allows for is, if this first came out, when AIDS or HIV first came out, we weren't allowed to be told if the patient had it or not. And this act actually says that medical responders must be told. And there's documentation we'll fill out anytime we believe that we have an exposure. So in summary, regulations can be lawfully enforced and usually will be. Standards are only enforceable if adopted into law, but again, remember, they can be brought into lawsuits. And we talk about what a reasonable person would do. Well, here you go. Would a reasonable person follow a standard such as NFPA 1500? And I think a jury is going to say yes. Regulations and standards often come from OSHA and other local and national organizations. Safety and health issues are ongoing considerations, and there are many regulations and standards that can provide an accepted framework for best practices. So again, when we're going to write an SOP or an SOG, standard operating procedures, standard operating guides, or even policies, you should go research these documents and make sure that your wording is the same there so that you're consistent.